Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different from our usual castles and kings. Something a bit lunar. Yes, that bright calm thing in the night sky you probably glance at while lying in bed, scrolling on your phone, wondering if it's judging you. That moon. The one that, once upon a time, the United States of America seriously considered blowing up with a nuclear bomb. Now, before you roll your eyes, settle in, because this isn't a Fast and Furious action story. No heroic astronauts or daring spy missions. It's mostly committees, memos, and men in suits nervously pushing pencils, while imagining how cool it would be to go full sci-fi apocalypse. So dim the lights, get cozy, and let's float slowly into a chapter of history that makes you realize sometimes humanity's greatest ideas are also its most quietly absurd ones. This little story starts in the 1950s, a time when the world was gripped by the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in a sort of global staring contest. Each side tried to outdo the other in missiles, spy planes, propaganda, and, well, sheer audacity. It was a decade when "let's blow up the moon" didn't sound completely insane. After all, if you can nuke an enemy's city, why not nuke a celestial body that can be seen from that city? The logic, of course, was a bit flexible. The origin of the idea can be traced to a man named Philip Morrison. He was a physicist, which meant he spent most of his days thinking about atoms, energy, and how to avoid accidentally destroying the world. Morrison was part of a team in the Air Force's newly formed Project A119. This project had a simple, terrifyingly vague goal: see if we could explode a nuclear device on the moon. The reasons weren't about science, exactly. They were about showing the Soviets that America had, shall we say, options. Loud options. Cosmic options. Options that could be seen with the naked eye from Earth. To put it mildly, the plan was ambitious. And by ambitious, I mean borderline cartoonish. Project engineers imagined launching a missile, filling it with a hydrogen bomb, and carefully calculating trajectories so the moon would light up in a sort of giant cosmic firework display. Imagine someone saying at a meeting, "Gentlemen, we could make the moon glow red for a few minutes," thereby terrifying the Soviets. And apparently, everyone nodded, because why not? The moon was up there, it was visible, and hey, it was a blank canvas. But of course, as with many government projects, the practical considerations were complicated. Launching a nuclear missile into space is not as simple as sending a letter or dropping a coin into a wishing well. There were questions about guidance systems, the stability of the bomb under cosmic conditions, and the tiny problem of, contaminating the moon with radioactive fallout. But these were mostly footnotes in the grander vision of "let's freak everyone out." Philip Morrison himself, as the story goes, was somewhat hesitant. He was a scientist, after all, and the moon was not his personal toy. He worried about the long-term consequences, including how the explosion might affect the moon's surface, or how it would be perceived back home if people realized the United States had essentially committed an interplanetary prank. But he also knew that the Cold War wasn't a time for mild caution. It was a time for dramatic, slightly absurd gestures. The project had military approval and funding, and the Air Force even conducted simulations. These weren't just doodles on a napkin. These were highly technical, terrifyingly precise calculations. The team considered everything, from the trajectory of the missile to the size of the bomb. They debated whether a smaller bomb that made a visible flash would be better than a larger one that might leave long-lasting marks. And somehow, through all these meetings and memos, nobody stopped to ask the obvious. Is this really a good idea? Meanwhile, the press was blissfully unaware, and the public continued to admire the moon for its serene glow. Most people probably assumed the moon was untouchable, serene, and a safe place for astronauts in the far-off future. Little did they know, somewhere in a drab office building in Washington, a team of physicists and military men were calculating exactly how to turn that serene satellite into the world's largest fireworks display. Of course, there were some intellectual challenges. For one, the bomb would need to survive the vacuum of space, the forces of launch, and a gentle but deadly collision with the lunar surface. The missile itself had to be powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity, which, as engineers often grumpily remind you, is not exactly an easy feat. And then there was the question of optics. Would the flash actually be visible from Earth? Could it be misinterpreted by astronomers as a natural lunar phenomenon? The team, in its infinite confidence, assured themselves that everything could be measured, calculated, and controlled. This, they believed, was entirely doable. By the late 1950s, Project A119 was fully underway. Scientists produced detailed plans, calculated explosive yields, and even considered naming the operation with something suitably vague to inspire awe and fear. Spoiler, they went with A119, which, to be fair, sounds like the sort of name a government gives to a project it's hoping nobody remembers in a few decades. But not everyone was sold on the idea. Some advisors quietly wondered whether destroying or even marking the moon might lead to cosmic consequences. Would it affect tides? Would it freak out astronauts? Would aliens, if they existed, find it rude? These concerns were usually brushed aside, partly because the Cold War demanded boldness, and partly because someone had to take the notes during meetings and they were very sleepy. Meanwhile, the team continued its meticulous work, as if preparing for a particularly dramatic science fair project. They mapped out launch windows, determined optimal bomb sizes, and ran mental simulations about how the explosion would look from Earth. The plan, as conceived, was a curious blend of genius, ambition, and sheer disregard for natural celestial order. The cultural backdrop is worth noting too. This was the era of space obsession. Rockets were glamorous, astronauts were celebrated, and nuclear weapons were simultaneously terrifying and, in some circles, oddly fun. Exploding the moon fit right into that mindset. Bold, flashy, and definitely something people would talk about at cocktail parties. If only the cocktail parties weren't worried about nuclear war on Earth. And then, as the story often goes, reality intervened. Technical limitations, moral questions, and perhaps a whisper of common sense led to the gradual abandonment of the project. By the time the 1960s rolled around, NASA's moon missions were in full swing, and Project A119 quietly faded into the background, leaving behind a dusty trail of memos, calculations, and the faint, lingering thought, "We almost did that." So, as you gaze at the moon tonight, remember that serene, glowing rock was once almost the centerpiece of America's most audacious cosmic stunt. And for now at least, it remains blissfully unnuked. So, if you're still awake, and I hope you are, because the moon doesn't nudge you awake, it just quietly judges your life choices, we can drift a little deeper into the mechanics of Project A119. The first thing to understand is that this wasn't a casual, let's point a firework at the sky scheme. No, this was serious business, the kind of thing that comes with slide rules, endless memos, and arguments over decimal points and equations no one could quite pronounce. The Air Force hired a team of physicists, astronomers, and engineers, mostly men who who had survived the atom bomb projects of World War II and were now looking for a slightly less horrifying, though still dazzling, outlet for their talents. Among them, Philip Morrison remained central, a quiet voice of reason in a chorus of people imagining cosmic fireworks. Morrison understood, better than most, that nuking the moon wasn't about science. It was about prestige, optics, and ego. And also, secretly, because nothing says superpower like blowing up a chunk of the night sky. Calculations were a nightmare. Space is big, the moon is far, and bombs are heavy. The team had to consider orbital mechanics, gravitational forces, atmospheric resistance, well, what little there is in the upper layers, and how not to accidentally blow up half of Florida on the way. These men spent countless hours staring at chalkboards filled with symbols that, to an untrained eye, looked like someone had sneezed into a geometry book. They debated whether to use a kiloton bomb or a megaton bomb, which for context, is a difference between flashy but harmless and, oh dear, maybe don't do this. They even ran early simulations of what the explosion would look like from Earth. Some imagined a small flash in the night sky, barely noticeable but symbolically terrifying. Others imagined a huge blazing spectacle, lighting up the moon like a cosmic disco ball. Opinions were divided, as they often are when dealing with the moon and nuclear weapons. The more ambitious physicists leaned toward the idea of a huge visual effect, reasoning that if the Soviets saw a bright red flash from the moon, they'd immediately know America had arrived and they meant business. Meanwhile, back on Earth, other people started asking practical questions. Questions like, what if the bomb doesn't explode? Or, what if we miscalculate and leave radioactive debris on the moon? These were mostly waved off with phrases like minor details and calculable risk. There was a certain charm to the Cold War logic. If you could calculate a risk, it was worth taking, even if the calculation was more hopeful than accurate. The cultural mindset of the time is important here. The 1950s were full of post-war optimism, fear, and fascination with rockets. Kids built model rockets, adults watched sci-fi films with exploding planets, and the United States government quietly plotted lunar nukes in office buildings. In a way, Project A119 fits neatly into this cultural landscape. It's part engineering, part madness, and entirely a statement. To those working on it, the moon wasn't just a rock in the sky. It was a stage, a canvas for the kind of spectacle that made Cold War politics a bit more colorful. And yes, there were ethical considerations, but they were mostly whispered in the background. Some scientists worried about the message being sent to future generations. Others worried about contaminating the moon with radioactive material. And still others quietly wondered if exploding the moon might be, let's say, socially awkward, if future astronauts showed up and saw chunks of debris. These concerns were politely noted in memos and then filed away. In particular, had a quiet skepticism. He often imagined explaining this to his grandchildren. Yes, dear, your grandfather once planned to nuke the moon. No, it didn't happen, thankfully. Morrison's role was less about enthusiasm and more about making sure the team didn't accidentally design a scenario in which the moon turned into a miniature asteroid belt heading toward Earth. A responsibility, perhaps, that only he took seriously. Meanwhile, the military planners were enjoying themselves. To them, Project A119 was the ultimate combination of science, spectacle, and intimidation. It had nothing to do with exploration, everything to do with psychological warfare. Imagine the Cold War press conference. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight the moon is ours, and it has never looked so glowing. The imagination required to even think this way is impressive and slightly terrifying. As the project progressed, documents revealed debates about the technical specifics. Should the bomb detonate on impact or above the surface for maximum visibility? What about the angle of approach? Should it hit the near side, visible from Earth, or the far side, which nobody could see, rendering the exercise pointless? The near side, of course, won. The far side, while mysterious and beautiful, offered no advantage in psychological warfare. Another subtle complication was the potential scientific fallout. Astronomers and astrophysicists raised questions about how a nuclear explosion might affect lunar observations. Would craters become radioactive? Would the moon's surface reflect light differently for decades? These concerns were mostly nodded at politely before being quietly set aside. After all, the project's goal was not scientific progress, but cosmic bravado. Even within the Air Force, opinions were divided. Some saw it as a brilliant, audacious demonstration of American ingenuity. Others recognized, deep down, that this might be the sort of story that future historians would call an unusual lapse in judgment. But, as often happens in bureaucracy, enthusiasm won over caution. Meetings continued, charts were updated, and the daydream of a nuclear moon marched quietly forward. The project never reached the point of actual launch. By the early 1960s, the space race had shifted focus. Instead of blowing up the moon, NASA was planning to land humans on it. Project A119 became an archival curiosity, a footnote in the Cold War playbook, and a reminder that sometimes governments can imagine the most extravagant, ridiculous gestures simply because they can. Interestingly, the story of Project A119 remained largely secret for decades. Documents were classified, scientists were sworn to silence, and the public continued to admire the moon without realizing it had narrowly escaped becoming a Cold War billboard. It wasn't until years later, when historians and journalists pieced together memos, correspondence, and technical notes, that the full story emerged. And when it did, reactions were a mixture of awe, disbelief, and mild amusement. Philip Morrison, for his part, continued his career with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen the inner workings of cosmic ambition and survived. He often reflected on the project with a mix of bemusement and relief. "It was technically possible," he once said, "but ethically questionable, to say the least." A gentle understatement, considering what could have happened if enthusiasm had overpowered caution. So by the mid-1960s, the moon remained untouched. Apollo missions would arrive, astronauts would walk on its surface, and humanity would continue to gaze up at it with wonder. Project A119 faded into obscurity, a curious footnote in Cold War history, and an example of what happens when imagination, ambition, and slightly reckless confidence intersect. And there you have it, a moon that almost witnessed a nuclear fireworks show, and scientists and generals who thought it was a good idea to even consider such a thing. As you lie in bed tonight, remember that history isn't just kings and wars, it's also the quiet, absurd ideas that never quite leave the drawing board, like blowing up the moon to impress your rival superpower. Now let's drift even further into the hazy, slightly absurd world of Project A119. We've covered the calculations, the memos, and the men in suits imagining a cosmic fireworks display. But a lot of people forget the other half of the story. What might have actually happened if someone had pushed the go button and nuked the moon? Spoiler alert, probably not as dramatic as Hollywood would make you think, but still weirdly fascinating. The first thing to understand is that the moon is, well, big. Bigger than most people think when they squint at it through a window at 2 a.m. That means even a hydrogen bomb, the kind of make a crater and scare the Soviets bomb the Air Force envisioned, wouldn't have obliterated it. The moon wouldn't have exploded like a giant rock piñata raining debris on Earth. It would have made a visible flash, a bright mark in the night sky, and maybe some new surface features that scientists decades later would notice with curiosity. Engineers calculated yields, trajectories, and impact points with painstaking precision. They wanted the bomb to detonate on the near side of the moon, the side we all casually stare at when lying awake, contemplating life, taxes, or why the Wi-Fi keeps dropping. A flash there would have been visible from Earth with the naked eye, the sort of spectacle that could make anyone glance up and think, that didn't happen yesterday. Or perhaps, oh, the Cold War just got really theatrical. The idea was, in essence, psychological warfare on a cosmic scale. If the Soviets saw a sudden flash on the moon, the hope was that they'd assume the Americans had gone full, next-level mad scientist. It was supposed to intimidate, to impress, and maybe even make them consider carefully whether their space program needed some recalibration. And of course, if the public found out, well, that was secondary. The public's reaction didn't really matter as long as the Soviets were sufficiently unsettled. But there were practical questions, quietly debated in the shadows. Would such a display ruin scientific observations? Possibly. The moon is used to measure all sorts of subtle phenomena. Tides, orbital mechanics, and even early telescope calibration. A sudden flash of nuclear fire could have thrown off measurements, left radioactive particles on the surface, and created unexpected hazards for future astronauts. Scientists quietly worried about contamination, but, as is often the case with Cold War projects, these were low-priority concerns compared to looking scary to the enemy. And then there's the slightly existential part. Blowing up the moon, even in a controlled, visible way, might have changed humanity's perception of the universe. The moon is comforting in its predictability. It rises, it sets, it phases itself in slow, reliable cycles. To see it suddenly marked glowing, or scarred by human hubris, might have been unnerving in a way that's hard to quantify. Some historians have speculated, with no small amount of snark, that if Project A119 had gone forward, humans might have spent the next few decades staring up at the moon thinking, yeah, maybe we should chill with the nukes. Another curious detail is that no one really thought about aliens. Not seriously. But imagine for a moment, somewhere in the vast universe, a sufficiently advanced civilization notices a flash on the moon. The diplomatic implications are unknown. Would they think, Earthlings are ambitious, or Earthlings are dangerously unhinged? The Air Force didn't leave room in the budget for interstellar PR, so this remained a minor, unspoken risk. Philip Morrison and his colleagues were acutely aware of the absurdity of it all. In interviews decades later, Morrison reflected on the project with a mix of bemusement and quiet relief. He emphasized that the plan was technically feasible, but morally, ethically, and socially questionable, which, in the 1950s, was apparently enough to make you a voice of reason in a sea of nuclear enthusiasm. Project A119 is also notable for what it tells us about Cold War psychology. The United States wasn't just competing with the Soviet Union in missiles, spies, and propaganda. It was competing in spectacle. The ability to awe, intimidate, and subtly terrify without firing a shot at Earth was considered a strategic advantage. And what's more impressive, or terrifying, is how seriously people took this. Entire memos, detailed calculations, and meetings went into a plan that by today's standards seems almost absurd. Meanwhile, the public remained blissfully unaware. Schools taught about astronomy, families gazed at the moon during backyard stargazing, and no one suspected that somewhere in Washington, someone had mapped out exactly how to turn that comforting sphere into a glowing reminder of geopolitical rivalry. The contrast is almost poetic. Humans dreaming about exploration and science, while their governments quietly imagined interplanetary intimidation. By the early 1960s, however, the world had changed. NASA was preparing for the Apollo program. The space race had become public and aspirational, rather than secret and threatening. And the military realized that Project A119 was, in practical terms, unnecessary. The idea of detonating a bomb on the moon was quietly shelved. Documents were classified. Memos were stored in dusty archives, and the project became a curious historical footnote. What remains fascinating, though, is the legacy of this little-known plan. It illustrates how ambition, imagination, and a touch of absurdity can intersect in history. The moon, serene and constant, was almost part of a bizarre performance of cosmic hubris. And while it was never blown up, the project left behind a trail of memos, calculations, and reflections that remind us how close humanity came to turning our celestial neighbor into a Cold War spectacle. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep and glance at the moon, remember, it was once almost the stage for humanity's most audacious, unnecessary, and slightly ridiculous cosmic show. And for now, it remains unscathed, quietly watching us, as always. So, if you're still awake, and I trust you are, or at least pretending, you're probably wondering what the people behind Project A119 were actually like. Not the memos, not the trajectories, not the explosions, but the humans. Because for all the technical brilliance and Cold War bravado, the people involved were, unsurprisingly, human. Nervous, ambitious, and occasionally very tired. Philip Morrison, whom we've met before, was quietly sensible. He had a reputation for being cautious, even as everyone around him leaned toward audacious. You can almost picture him in a meeting, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, glancing at a diagram of a hydrogen bomb aimed at the moon, and thinking, well, this is definitely going to make a great anecdote someday. Hopefully not in a courtroom. He wasn't alone in his hesitations. Some physicists privately joked, very quietly because this was the military, that perhaps the moon deserved a little respect. Period. Most of the team, though, was enthusiastic in that very particular way that scientists get when you combine cutting-edge physics, government funding, and the possibility of doing something unprecedented. They argued over details that to an outsider might seem absurd. The precise shade of flash the bomb should produce, the angle at which it should hit, and whether the explosion should leave a tiny crater or simply mark the surface. Some even produced sketches of the moon, with a little red star drawn on it. Meetings were often long, meticulous, and a little surreal. Men in suits, Air Force officers who had spent the last decade calculating bombs on Earth, sat alongside men in lab coats who preferred chalkboards to briefings. They debated in serious tones whether the moon could handle a nuclear detonation. And no, they weren't joking. One could imagine a historian centuries from now reading the notes and thinking these people really took their work seriously. Because of course, they did. The project had its share of personalities. Some were ambitious and eager to leave a mark on history, literally. Others were quietly terrified of the possible consequences. Some even began to ponder cosmic etiquette. Yes, cosmic etiquette. Should humans really be doing this? Does one sign a permission slip to celestial bodies, or just forge ahead because Cold War? These philosophical musings mostly went unrecorded, which in hindsight was probably for the best. Interestingly, The secrecy surrounding the project shaped behavior in subtle ways. Men carried briefcases filled with classified documents, memoranda with diagrams of lunar detonation, and notes about yields and trajectories. They were walking around with the literal fate of the moon in folders under their arms. The combination of pride, anxiety, and caffeine must have been remarkable. Imagine trying to explain your career to your spouse at the end of the day. Yes, dear, today I planned how to nuke the moon. No, it didn't happen. And yet, for all the secrecy, some anecdotes suggest a touch of humor in these offices. One story tells of scientists joking about what astronomers in remote observatories might think if they suddenly saw a nuclear flash on the moon. Would they assume a UFO attack, alien mischief, or just the US trying to win a cosmic popularity contest? It's comforting, in a very tiny way, to know that even the people plotting one of the most audacious ideas in history had a sense of humor. A faint, jittery, slightly dark sense of humor. As the 1960s approached, Project A119 began to face practical roadblocks. Rocket technology was improving, but sending a bomb to the moon was still extremely difficult. The weight of the payload, guidance systems, and launch timing all presented challenges that, while theoretically solvable, were messy and expensive. And unlike Hollywood movies, where astronauts just point and fire, reality required meticulous precision. One tiny miscalculation, and the bomb could miss the moon entirely, or worse, veer toward Earth. At this point, the scientists started to breathe a little easier. Not because the project was being canceled yet, but because the scale of the task was daunting enough to make anyone reconsider. After all, nuking the moon is one thing in theory. It's another when you realize a stray calculation could turn your country's symbolic gesture into a real-life disaster. And then, of course, the Cold War itself began to shift focus. The space race was becoming public. NASA was preparing for Apollo missions. And suddenly, the goal of the United States was no longer terrify the Soviets from afar, but land humans on the moon, take photos, bring them back, and look really impressive doing it. Which, from a public relations standpoint, was less likely to anger future generations or aliens. By the time the early 1960s rolled around, Project A119 quietly fizzled. There was no grand announcement. No one threw a ceremonial button into a countdown chamber. It simply became classified history, tucked away in dusty archives. A project that existed in memos, diagrams, and the memories of men who once carried the moon's potential destruction in briefcases. But the story didn't entirely disappear. In the decades that followed, historians and journalists began piecing together the project from declassified documents. They discovered the careful calculations, the sketches, the memos, and the discussions about ethical, practical, and psychological implications. And as the story emerged, people reacted the way one might upon hearing that someone once seriously considered nuking the moon. With disbelief, mild amusement, and, if you're a historian, a quiet appreciation for humanity's occasional absurdity. Philip Morrison, when asked in later years about the project, emphasized the technical feasibility while acknowledging its ethical complications. He explained that while the plan could have worked, it would have been morally questionable, socially awkward, and a little over the top, even by Cold War standards. In other words, he summarized it perfectly. It was exactly the kind of idea that only the 1950s and 1960s could have produced, when ambition, anxiety, and imagination collided in government offices across the country. So as we float gently through the memories of Project A119, it's worth noting a few things. First, the moon is still intact, serene, and unnuked. Second, humanity once came very close to demonstrating cosmic bravado in a literal, observable way. And third, the men behind the plan were, in their own way, just doing their jobs, calculating, debating, worrying, and occasionally joking about the absurdity of planning a lunar nuclear explosion. And tonight, as you glance at the moon, remember that it almost became a billboard for human ambition, ego, and slightly reckless science. But it didn't. And for now, that's probably for the best. The moon remains our quiet, glowing companion, silently judging, and maybe, just maybe, grateful that humanity has a little more sense than it sometimes appears to. So let's drift a little further into the story, now floating gently between what happened, what almost happened, and what might have happened. Because Project A119 didn't just sit quietly in dusty archives. It also seeped, albeit subtly, into culture, imagination, and the scientific psyche. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the space race had become a spectacle for the public. Rockets, satellites, and astronauts dominated the headlines. People were building model rockets in basements and watching grainy images of Earth from space, marveling at how small and fragile it looked. And all the while, unknown to the public, a group of men once considered turning the moon into a dramatic, glowing warning to the Soviets. Imagine reading a newspaper with Apollo 11 coverage on the front page and knowing that only a few years prior, someone had drawn a little red star on the moon with a hydrogen bomb. In hindsight, Project A119 has a curious cultural resonance. It represents a Cold War mindset where technological capability, imagination, and ego intersected in the most unusual ways. It's the sort of story that makes you realize sometimes history isn't just kings, battles, and revolutions. Sometimes it's a group of adults deciding whether nuking a celestial body is a good idea. And the fact that it stayed secret for decades makes it feel even more surreal. Historians and journalists, piecing together the story, were struck by the absurd precision of the planning. Diagrams, memos, and technical notes showed how seriously the team had considered everything. The bomb's yield, the angle of impact, and even the psychological response on Earth. They debated whether a smaller, controlled flash would suffice, or whether a larger, dramatic detonation would leave a lasting impression on observers. In other words, they were debating aesthetics, nuclear aesthetics, on the moon. And this is where the story drifts into the slightly hypothetical. Imagine for a moment that the plan had gone forward. On some clear night, you glance at the moon and notice a sudden, unnerving flash. Perhaps astronomers with telescopes note an unexpected glow. The news might spread quickly, and conspiracy theories would erupt. Aliens? Soviet attack? America has finally lost its mind? The possibilities are endless, and slightly terrifying if you're prone to overthinking while lying in bed. Some historians like to speculate about the scientific consequences as well. Would the moon's surface have been altered? Would lunar dust have shifted in a way that affected observations for decades? Might astronauts visiting the moon in the 1970s or later have stepped onto slightly radioactive footprints? All of these questions are, of course, hypothetical, because thankfully none of it came to pass, but imagining it helps illuminate the audacity of human ambition during the Cold War. Culturally, the story of Project A119 has slowly trickled into pop culture, mostly as a curious anecdote. Science fiction authors, Cold War historians, and space enthusiasts often mention it as a what-could-have-been scenario. And it's easy to see why. The idea of blowing up the moon, or even making it flash dramatically, is simultaneously terrifying, absurd, and strangely poetic. The moon, our serene and comforting companion, almost became a stage for cosmic hubris. Meanwhile, the people who worked on the project carried on with their careers. Some continued in academia, others in military research, and some even became quiet advisors for NASA and other space programs. Philip Morrison, the cautious voice amidst the excitement, often reflected on the project with a gentle mix of pride and relief. Pride for the technical skill involved, relief that it never actually happened, and a little bemusement at how human imagination can sometimes drift into the absurd. Interestingly, the secrecy surrounding Project A119 meant that for decades, the moon remained untouched, a symbol of calm in an otherwise tense global landscape. And perhaps that's the most important legacy of this story. The moon was spared from being used as a political tool, a reminder that even in times of intense rivalry, restraint sometimes wins over audacity. Yet, despite being quietly forgotten for years, the project has an enduring charm for historians and enthusiasts. It's a reminder that human history isn't always a sequence of wars and treaties. Sometimes it's a collection of strange, ambitious ideas, quietly tucked away in memos, waiting for someone decades later to marvel at the absurdity. And Project A119 fits perfectly into this category. A technically feasible, morally questionable, utterly audacious plan that the world never got to see. So, as you stare at the moon tonight, remember that its calm, silver glow could have been interrupted by the kind of Cold War bravado that makes you blink in disbelief. A nuclear flash, a scarred surface, and perhaps a few panicked astronomers, all from a plan that never left the drawing board. And perhaps that's comforting. The moon, our quiet sentinel, remains serene, untarnished, and completely unnuked. Now let's drift a little deeper into the psychology behind Project A119. Because while the technical plans, memos, and bomb sketches are fascinating, they're only half the story. The other half is the peculiar way humans, particularly those living under the pressures of the Cold War, think about power, prestige, and the occasional cosmic flex. The 1950s were a time of constant tension. The United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a global staring contest, each side trying to outdo the other in rockets, missiles, spies, and, well, sheer audacity. Every demonstration of technological prowess mattered, not only as a statement of capability, but as a subtle way to intimidate the other side. In this context, Project A119 starts to make sense, not in a good idea sense, but in a desperate to impress sense. The psychologists of the era might have called it performance anxiety on a planetary scale. Leaders wanted to assert dominance without starting World War III. And what's more visible, intimidating, and slightly theatrical than a nuclear explosion on the moon? The reasoning, in a way, was straightforward. If you can't terrify your rival on Earth, do it in space. Because nothing says we have the power like lighting up the night sky in a display that's visible from hundreds of miles away. Military planners loved the idea for its symbolic value. The moon, silent, distant, and untouchable, could become a billboard for American ingenuity and strength. And importantly, it wouldn't require immediate retaliation. Unlike nuking a city, this was a show of capability, without bloodshed, at least on Earth. The moral calculus was simple. A flash on the moon was terrifying, but it was also safe, theoretically speaking. And in the bureaucratic logic of the time, that counted for something. Yet underneath the bravado, there were nerves. Some scientists worried about public perception, ethical concerns, and unintended consequences. They debated whether a bright flash on the moon might lead to panic, confusion, or international condemnation. But as is often the case when ambition and ego collide, these concerns were largely secondary. The thrill of imagining a visible demonstration of power was too alluring. It's fascinating, from a historical perspective, to consider the mindset that allowed such a project to exist. Leaders and scientists imagined a world where a glowing moon could send a message stronger than diplomacy, louder than propaganda, and more lasting than any speech. And they debated it seriously, with memos, charts, and diagrams. This is the human side of Cold War history. Not just missiles and spies, but imagination, anxiety, and a touch of absurdity. And then there's the question of consequences, both practical and hypothetical. If the moon had been nuked, astronomers might have seen a sudden flash, a strange glow, or even subtle changes on the lunar surface. Future astronauts could have landed in slightly altered terrain. Geologists might have puzzled over a tiny radioactive scar for decades. And the general public? Well, most people probably would have been vaguely unsettled, staring up at the night sky and wondering what the heck was happening. It's also worth noting the subtle irony here. Humans who were so anxious about nuclear war on Earth seriously considered nuking a celestial body purely for psychological effect. The moon, distant and untouchable, became a canvas for human ambition. And the fact that it never happened is perhaps the quietest, most reassuring part of the story. The moon remained untouched, serene, and indifferent to human drama. Philip Morrison, reflecting years later, described the project as technically feasible but ethically questionable. That's historians speak for, we could have done it, but maybe we shouldn't have. And in that understatement lies a gentle lesson about ambition, restraint, and the peculiar intersections of imagination and responsibility. The Cold War, in many ways, encouraged such audacious ideas. Both superpowers were obsessed with optics, demonstration, and the symbolic use of technology. Exploding the moon was never about necessity. It was about showing that America could do something extraordinary, terrifying, and impossible, and do it first. In a way, it's almost charming if you ignore the nuclear part. And yet, the project quietly faded. By the time NASA was making plans for manned moon missions, the idea of a nuclear demonstration seemed less impressive and more risky. Public opinion, practical constraints, and the reality of space travel all contributed to the slow demise of Project A119. Documents were classified, memos stored, and the story remained largely hidden for decades. In hindsight, the project offers a window into the peculiar combination of brilliance, anxiety, and absurdity that characterized Cold War thinking. It shows how ambition can stretch from Earth to the heavens, how imagination can outpace ethics, and how sometimes the most audacious ideas quietly never happen. And that, in itself, is a kind of comforting story. The moon remained safe, visible, and serenely indifferent to the political machinations of humans below. So tonight, as you drift off and glance at that familiar glowing orb, remember that it once almost became a stage for human bravado, a flash of light, a faint scar, and perhaps a reminder that even in times of tension, restraint sometimes wins. The moon, calm and eternal, quietly watches. And we, thankfully, are left with its gentle light, rather than a demonstration of nuclear theater. Now let's float gently into the aftermath of Project A119, a time when the plan quietly faded into obscurity, leaving behind memos, sketches, and an air of what historians politely call human ambition run slightly wild. The project never reached launch, never made headlines, and mostly remained classified. For decades, the moon continued its serene vigil over Earth, blissfully unaware that it had narrowly escaped being part of a Cold War spectacle. The secrecy surrounding the project was typical for military programs of the time. Files were stamped top secret, memos were shuffled into locked cabinets, and anyone who worked on the project was sworn to confidentiality. And because the Cold War was, in part, a competition of appearances, the government had every reason to keep this little lunar experiment under wraps. After all, imagine explaining, in the middle of tense international relations, that your country had seriously considered nuking the moon. It's the sort of thing that could cause awkward questions at the United Nations. For the general public, the story of Project A119 remained unknown. Children studied the moon in classrooms, astronomers plotted its craters, and poets waxed lyrical about its gentle glow. The world admired the moon as if it had never even heard of military interest in its surface. And perhaps, in a way, that ignorance was the moon's first victory. It remained untarnished, serene, and untouched, quietly laughing at the hubris of humans far below. When the story finally emerged decades later, historians and journalists were delighted. They discovered meticulous memos, detailed calculations, and diagrams showing how the moon could have been used as a theater for psychological warfare. The public reaction was a mixture of disbelief, mild amusement, and a little admiration for audacity. After all, it's not every day you learn that someone once considered turning the moon into a giant firework for political purposes. Project A119 even found its way into popular culture, mostly in the form of curious anecdotes, documentaries, and references in science fiction. Writers and filmmakers have occasionally toyed with the idea, imagining worlds where the moon was scarred, glowing, or otherwise altered by human ambition. It serves as a reminder that sometimes history is stranger than fiction. Not because people did the impossible, but because they imagined it seriously. Interestingly, the project also influenced how scientists and military planners approached space in the years that followed. While nuking the moon was never pursued again, the careful calculations, trajectory planning, and technical work laid a foundation for later space missions. In a quiet, indirect way, Project A119 contributed to the growing body of knowledge about rocketry, guidance systems, and lunar observation. So even a plan that never happened still left traces in the scientific record. The human element, of course, remained fascinating. Philip Morrison, the physicist at the center of the project, and his colleagues often reflected on it with a mix of relief and bemusement. They had been part of something audacious, absurd, and technically possible. Yet they had also exercised restraint, though mostly by accident, as the changing priorities of the space race and public scrutiny made the project increasingly impractical. It's a subtle reminder that sometimes history's quiet victories are the ones that never happen. The cultural legacy of the plan is also worth noting. Project A119 represents a unique intersection of ambition, science, and imagination. It shows how, in a time of intense rivalry, humans can conceive ideas that are simultaneously brilliant, absurd, and slightly terrifying. And while the moon remains untouched, the story of this near miss has captured the imagination of historians, writers, and space enthusiasts alike. Some speculate on how differently space exploration might have unfolded if the moon had been marked by human ambition in this way. Would astronauts have approached their missions differently? Would public perception of the moon have been altered? Would the psychological impact of a nuclear flash visible from Earth have had political consequences far beyond the intended scope? These questions are, of course, hypothetical, but they add a layer of quiet fascination to the story. So tonight, as you stare at the moon, imagine it serene, calm, and unmarked by human ambition. Remember that, for a brief period, it was almost transformed into a glowing billboard for Cold War bravado. And perhaps, quietly, Be grateful that it remained indifferent, untarnished, and eternal, watching over Earth as it always has, a silent witness to humanity's occasional flights of audacity. In the end, Project A119 is a story about restraint, imagination, and the odd ways humans try to assert power. It reminds us that history is not only about wars, kings, and treaties, but also about ideas. Sometimes ridiculous, sometimes brilliant, quietly shape our world, even when they never leave the drawing board. Now let's float gently into the technical what-ifs of Project A119, because while it's fascinating to imagine bureaucrats debating cosmic intimidation, it's also quietly mesmerizing to consider the physics behind it. How a hydrogen bomb might interact with the moon, how it would appear from Earth, and what hypothetical consequences could have followed. First, let's remind ourselves that the moon is a big, rocky, and oddly indifferent place. Its surface is covered with regolith, a layer of dusty, fragmented rock formed over billions of years by meteoroid impacts. A nuclear detonation, even one carefully calculated, would have been visible, yes, but it would not have shattered the moon or sent it careening toward Earth. The physics are simple in their own way. Gravity holds the moon in orbit. The explosion would dissipate quickly into the vacuum of space, and the moon would remain largely intact. The scientists at Project A119 debated bomb yield carefully. They wanted something visible from Earth, so a small tactical nuke wouldn't do the trick. But they also didn't want to overdo it. A massive bomb risked leaving a permanent scar, or, heaven forbid, creating unpredictable debris. The goal was psychological impact, not lunar demolition. This delicate balance, visible flash without catastrophic consequences, was the heart of the technical challenge. Trajectory was another major concern. The bomb needed to hit the moon precisely. Too shallow an angle, and it could skip off the surface, or create a weird ricochet effect. Too steep, and it could create a crater larger than intended, altering the moon's appearance for decades. The calculations were meticulous, involving velocity, angle, orbital mechanics, and timing. And yes, all of this was done without modern computer simulations. Imagine rows of chalkboards, formulas scribbled furiously, and men leaning back in chairs, imagining a red glow spreading across the lunar surface. Visibility from Earth was crucial. Scientists ran simulations, hand calculations, slide rules, and mental approximations of how the detonation would appear to the naked eye. Would it be a tiny flicker, a faint glow, or a dramatic flash? They wanted it to be noticeable, but not so overwhelming that everyone panicked. Ideally, astronomers and observant citizens would notice, spread the story, and the Soviets would worry quietly. The moon would become a cosmic stage, and Earthlings would unwittingly witness the performance. Radiation and surface effects were also considered. A nuclear explosion would release energy, heat, and possibly a small amount of radioactive material. Scientists debated whether the moon's regolith would absorb or reflect this energy, whether it would leave detectable traces, and how it might affect future lunar exploration. In other words, they thought carefully about contamination, but also quietly hoped that future astronauts wouldn't have to wear extra protective gear. And of course, the hypothetical consequences on Earth were discussed. Would a bright flash cause alarm? Would astronomers assume an extraterrestrial event? Would conspiracy theorists have a field day decades before they were even invented? The planners imagined these scenarios quietly, because public panic was undesirable. After all, psychological warfare works best when the intended audience, the Soviets, reacts, but the home front remains calm. Interestingly, the project also considered the moon's phases. A detonation timed during a full moon would be less noticeable, because the surface was already bright. Conversely, during a new moon, the flash would stand out dramatically against the dark sky. The team, as meticulous as it was ambitious, plotted detonation windows months in advance, accounting for orbital mechanics and visibility. It's oddly comforting to imagine these scientists, coffee cups in hand, staring at calendars filled with lunar calculations, quietly debating when a nuclear flash would look best. Meteorite impacts, the regolith's reflectivity, and lunar gravity were also part of the discussion. Scientists debated whether a small crater would appear, whether dust would scatter light, and how long the flash would linger in the moon's tenuous exosphere. Even the faintest reflection could add to the psychological effect, so they considered every nuance of lunar physics. The result was an impressively detailed plan, one that never left the board, but demonstrated the quiet brilliance and slight absurdity of Cold War ambition. By the end of Project A119, the consensus was clear. Technically feasible, morally questionable, and practically unnecessary. The moon would remain untouched, serene, and indifferent. Astronauts would land safely years later. Astronomers would continue studying craters, and the public would go on admiring its calm glow without ever knowing how close it came to a moment of Cold War theatrics. In other words, the moon dodged a nuclear performance. Humanity exercised a rare bit of restraint, and history quietly saved itself from one of the more absurd what-ifs in space exploration. And tonight, as you look up at that familiar orb, remember that every crater's shadow, every gentle phase, is untouched by human ego, at least for now. Now, let's drift into the quieter, more human side of Project A119. The people behind it, the memos they wrote, and the stories that quietly surfaced decades later. While diagrams, calculations, and physics are fascinating, the real charm lies in imagining the humans who once carried the moon's fate in briefcases and chalk marks. Philip Morrison, as we've met, remained a steady voice of reason amidst the cosmic enthusiasm. He often reflected later on the absurdity and audacity of the project. Morrison noted that the plan was technically feasible, but morally questionable, ethically dubious, and socially complicated. His tone, decades later, carries a gentle bemusement, as if he's whispering, "Yes, we did think about nuking the moon. No, we didn't actually do it. And yes, it was as strange as it sounds." Other scientists involved had similar reflections. Some were proud of the technical achievement, the meticulous calculations, the precise planning, and the ambitious reach. Others were quietly relieved that the project never progressed. There's an old anecdote about a group of engineers joking, very quietly, because secrecy mattered, about what astronomers might think if they saw a nuclear flash on the moon. They imagined bewildered telescope operators muttering, "Well, that wasn't in the star charts." A faint humor ran through the corridors of a project, otherwise defined by precision and Cold War seriousness. The memos themselves are fascinating artifacts. Meticulous notes about bomb yield, angles of approach, and visibility from Earth fill the archives. Charts calculating the ideal timing during lunar phases, diagrams of expected flashes, and musings about the potential psychological effect on the Soviets are preserved as reminders that human imagination can be as ambitious as it is absurd. Reading them today, one almost expects to find doodles in the margins, little moons with tiny hypothetical explosions. Secrecy, of course, was paramount. The project was classified at the highest levels. Documents were stored in locked cabinets, memos carried in briefcases, and discussions carefully monitored. Even within the military, the plan was something that only a select few could access. And because of this, Project A119 quietly faded from memory once the priorities of the space race shifted toward manned lunar missions. Decades later, historians and journalists began piecing the story together from declassified documents. They discovered sketches, technical plans, memos, and notes that revealed just how seriously people considered turning the moon into a glowing statement of geopolitical dominance. Reactions were predictably a mix of disbelief, mild amusement, and admiration for audacity. The world had come remarkably close to a lunar spectacle that never happened, and the moon remained serene. There's something quietly poetic about this rediscovery. The moon, which had silently observed humans' petty squabbles and grand ambitions for billions of years, had once almost witnessed a human-made flash visible from Earth. But it didn't. It remained calm, indifferent, and eternal. And the people who had once carried the idea in their heads, briefcases, and chalk-stained notebooks, quietly moved on, leaving history to preserve their audacious daydream. Interestingly, the rediscovery of Project A119 sparked a new wave of curiosity. Popular science books, documentaries, and articles began exploring the project. Writers marveled at the technical ambition, the psychological strategy, and the almost whimsical audacity of the plan. For some, it became a symbol of Cold War imagination. How seriously humans can take their own cleverness, and how far they'll stretch it when rivalry and ambition are involved. The human stories are just as compelling as the technical ones. Men and women, some young and ambitious, others cautious and calculating, debated how to make the moon glow without permanently scarring it. They considered the possible global reaction, the effects on future space exploration, and even the faintest ethical questions. And in the end, like so many plans in history, they quietly filed it away. It never launched, never flashed, and never became a spectacle. Yet the story survives, quietly, like a footnote in human ambition. And tonight, as you drift off, you can imagine those men sitting quietly at their desks, sketching trajectories, making calculations, and perhaps shaking their heads in private amusement. Their work, meticulous and imaginative, remains a fascinating reminder of the intersection between human ambition, imagination, and restraint. The moon, as ever, remains untouched and serene, silently observing our curious impulses. So, as we drift toward the gentle conclusion of this story, let's take a moment to reflect. Project A119, the audacious Cold War plan to nuke the moon, is more than a curious historical footnote. It's a story about ambition, imagination, restraint, and the quietly absurd lengths humans will go to in the name of prestige. From its earliest calculations, sketches, and memos, the project represents the remarkable combination of brilliance and audacity that characterized the mid-20th century. Scientists meticulously debated bomb yields, angles, and lunar visibility. Military planners imagined a glowing message to their geopolitical rivals. And somewhere in the mix, philosophers of a very quiet sort wondered about ethics, cosmic responsibility, and the faint absurdity of the whole enterprise. What is perhaps most striking is how seriously it was taken. Not a single person involved treated the plan lightly, even as it bordered on the ridiculous. They argued, calculated, and debated with the same care that goes into real scientific or military endeavors. It's a reminder that human imagination can stretch into the vastness of space, contemplating scenarios simultaneously brilliant, terrifying, and absurd. Yet for all its technical brilliance, the project never left the drawing board. Changing priorities, the progress of the space race, and practical challenges quietly shelved the plan. The moon, indifferent as ever, remained untouched. And in this restraint lies a gentle lesson. Sometimes the most remarkable decisions in history are the ones that never happen. Sometimes the act of not doing something is its own quiet victory. Decades later, historians piecing together memos, diagrams, and technical notes marvel at the project. They discovered careful calculations, hypothetical flash effects, and plans for public and psychological impact. The story is now part of the rich tapestry of Cold War history, a story of imagination, ambition, and subtle absurdity. And for those of us looking back, it serves as both entertainment and reflection, a reminder that history is sometimes quieter, stranger, and more human than we ever expected. Perhaps the most comforting part is the moon itself. It remains serene, untarnished, and eternal. It continues to rise and set, to wax and wane, entirely unconcerned with human ambition or the fleeting dramas below. For millennia, it has observed kings, wars, revolutions, and yes, even audacious plans to nuke it for political prestige. And tonight, it continues its silent vigil, quietly reminding us of scale, permanence, and perspective. As you drift toward sleep, let the moon's calm glow guide your thoughts. Remember that humans once imagined extraordinary spectacles in space, considered audacious ideas, and ultimately exercised restraint. History is filled with these quiet near misses, projects, plans, and schemes that could have dramatically altered our perception of the universe, but thankfully did not. Project A119, in its meticulous absurdity, reminds us of human creativity and ambition, and also, thankfully, our occasional wisdom. It's a story about imagination stretching to the moon and back, about meticulous calculations, Cold War bravado, and a planet quietly observed by a celestial neighbor that has survived billions of years of cosmic chaos and nearly a human-made nuclear flash. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the moon as it is, glowing softly, serene, untarnished, and silently watching. Let yourself drift into sleep, knowing that history is full of audacity, but also restraint. And somewhere in the quiet darkness of the universe, the moon continues to shine, untouched by ambition, indifferent to ego, and eternally beautiful. Good night.